Go the Distance, Chapter 20, The Unknown. The storm raged for what felt like hours, lightning crackling across the sky and wind rampaging. The thunder was so loud the trio didn't speak. They just rowed and continued looking at the mended sail, wondering if or when it would crack under the strain of the wind. It will hold, Meg told herself, trying her best to believe. This boat will get us to where we need to go. When their arms had begun to ache terribly from continuous rowing, and their bodies started to shiver from being so wet, the storm stopped and the boat began to slow down. The sky was still dark and gray, and thunder rumbled in the distance, but the storm was pulling away. In its place, a low-lying fog began to roll in, blackening much of the landscape. Phil and Meg wiped the water from their eyes and looked at one another. "We're alive," Phil said as he wrung water out of his fur. "I'm not sure if we'll ever get dry from the storm, but look!" He pointed off the bow of the ship. "The river seems to be widening again. This must mean that we're close to the crossing of the three rivers and the entrance to the underworld." He looked at Meg in awe. "You did it, Red. You got notice to bring a storm, and it carried us the rest of the way here." "I did, didn't I?" Meg said, feeling pleased with herself as she squeezed the water from her ponytail. The river definitely looked like it widened up ahead, but it was hard to see much of anything in this thickening fog. Notice, she thought. His sometimes wicked storms seemed to also bring in a lot of fog, shrouding the river completely in mystery. Meg pulled the hourglass out of the satchel and Phil peered over her shoulder. The glowing pink sand in the lower chamber had climbed higher since she'd last checked. "Halfway full," Phil said, somewhat glumly. "Looks like we lost about half a day between the birds and the lack of the wind pushing our sails." Meg tucked the hourglass away again and tried to think positively. 5 days is still a lot of time to find Katerina, right? She looked at him. "Oh yeah," Phil agreed quickly. "Think of all you've done in 5 days already." It was true. How had it only been 5 days since this journey started? In that time, she'd been to hell and back, left Wonder Boy on Mount Olympus, fought in Impusa for Athena's flute, gained the god of war and wisdom's trust, made peace with Aegeus, almost killed them all with her jaunt to get a golden apple, and gotten a pep talk from Aphrodite. And she'd fought with Hercules. Meg closed her eyes, wishing to block that last bit out. What she wouldn't give to tell him how sorry she was for the way she treated him. She had to believe she would see him again, but for now she had to concentrate on the journey ahead. This next part was going to be the hardest part of all. "We should see Karen any second now," Phil said, sounding anxious. "Sorry, just the thought of that guy gives me the creeps. But it's going to be fine," he added quickly. "Are you ready?" Meg patted her satchel and motioned to Athena's flute, which was hanging from her waist. "As ready as I'll ever be, I guess. I know what I have to do. First step is getting past the three-headed mutt." Phil nodded. "Steer clear of Hades as long as you can, and get to Asphodel Meadows. "Got it," Meg repeated, taking deep breaths. The current beneath them was starting to pick up, bringing her closer and closer to the river Styx. The end of their time together was fast approaching, which meant that soon she'd be alone. Meg's heart started to beat more quickly. The only time she traveled the river Styx before was with Hades. She'd never been in Karen's boat by herself. She and Phil looked at one another. She had a feeling they were thinking the same thing. "Phil, I don't know how to thank you for getting me this far." There was so much she wanted to say and not enough time to do it. "I know I'm not your favorite person." "You weren't," Phil admitted. "But you are now. What you did back there with the birds to save me, that took guts." He swallowed hard. "You're going to do this thing, Red. I can feel it." "Thanks, Phil," Meg said, feeling her throat tighten. They looked at one another as the fog overtook them. Meg could hardly see the hand in front of her face. The air grew cold, and the sound of the birds on the river disappeared. The boat seemed to stop moving, and then it started to spin. "Hang on," Meg said as the boat moved faster and faster, twirling round and round till she couldn't tell which way was north and which way was south. Finally the boat shot forward. guiding through the mist and coming to another halt in the middle of the lake, where the fog began to fade. A charred wall of rock began to appear in front of her. The mountainside was dotted with dead trees and looked like they had been destroyed by fire. Near the base of the mountain was a cave with a river running through it, the entrance to the underworld. A small boat emerged and moved slowly toward them. It was ferried by a skeleton-like creature. Hades' minion who ferried the dead in the underworld made her anxious. Meg placed one hand on Athena's flute to steady herself. "You can do this," she told herself, standing quietly as the boat approached. "Trust yourself." Karen paused and sniffed the air as he approached. "Mortals, you may not enter here." "We can pay, Karen," Meg said quickly, and he glanced at her curiously. "We can?" Phil repeated. "Yes, give him a drachma," Meg instructed. He looked at her blankly. "I don't have any drachmas." "What do you mean you have no drachmas?" she hissed. You knew you were getting me to the entrance to the underworld. Everyone needs a drachma to get there." "Right." Phil scratched one of his horns. "I forgot about that part." "How could you forget? Hey, Red, we need some other pressing things to worry about, like getting you in here in the first place and in one piece." Meg groaned, unable to believe they hadn't discussed this before. "Well, what do we do now?" she asked. "I don't know." Phil started to pace. "If we don't have one, they say Karen makes you wait, and we don't have a day to spare. Where am I going to find a coin?" Phil started overturning everything in the boat in his search, but Meg knew he couldn't find one. Agius would never be as careless as to leave a coin behind. Where could she get a drachma fast? Think, Meg. She didn't feel right calling on Hercules for this, but she could call on her guide, couldn't she? Meg looked up. "Athena, god of war and wisdom, guide to heroes and caretaker of those on journeys. If you can see us or hear me now, we could really use your help here." She whispered, "I need a drachma." Nothing happened. A low growl emerged from Karen's mouth. "Do you have payment or not? I have many souls to transport today." "Please, Athena," Meg tried again. "I will take your knowledge and your gifts with me to the other side, but this I can't do without your help." Meg thought for a moment about what might sway her. "Someday I will thank you in person and play your flute, and when I do, you'll feel my music with your heart, I promise." Meg and Phil looked to the sky, both imagining a coin falling from the clouds. Nothing happened. Meg was starting to join Phil in his panic when she felt something cool appear in her right hand. She opened her palm. It was a silver drachma. "Smart move, kid," Phil cried. "We have a drachma." "Yes," Karen hissed, reaching a skeletal hand out for payment. "Thank you, Athena," Meg said solemnly to the sky. "I guess it's time for me to go." "Wait," Phil said quickly. "What if you asked Athena for 2 more coins?" He eyed the cave ahead of him. "We could go with you, you know. Maybe we could be of some help down there." Meg smiled warmly. She couldn't believe that what Phil was offering. Even though they both knew that he couldn't follow, it was a touching offer nonetheless. The fact that she was heading back into the underworld, a place mortals did not leave, let alone escape twice, was starting to feel ever more real. "You're gonna miss me that much, huh?" He rolled his eyes. "No, I just don't want you getting yourself in trouble without me." They looked at one another and Meg hesitated. "Phil, if I don't make it back, tell Hercules—" "No." Phil cut her off. "I'm not giving any messages. Tell him yourself when you get back." "But if I don't," Meg insisted, "promise me you'll tell Hercules that I—" She swallowed, still unsure of the right words. "Let him know that I— just tell him I'm sorry." Phil met her gaze, his face as serious as she'd ever seen it. "Okay." Meg moved towards the edge of the boat. She felt her satchel for the crotala and her waist to make sure the flute was still attached. She rubbed Pegasus's nose, and he neighed sadly. Meg felt a tug at her heart. And Phil, one more thing? Anything, he said. If I don't return, make sure Hercules moves on from all of this, Meg said. Meg. Phil swallowed hard. It was the first time he called her by her actual name. He tried to pull her spinning thoughts into words. I don't want him wasting his immortality on me. He's a good guy who gives so much of himself. He deserves to have someone do that for him in return. Got it? Phil looked at her. Wow, you really do love the guy, don't you? Meg didn't answer. She handed the coin to Karen, and he motioned for her to step into the boat. When she turned around and looked at Phil and Peg again one more time, see you on the other side, she said, hoping she sounded surer than she felt. You will, Phil said, but tears were streaming down his face. Even Peg looked upset. I know it. I'll see you in a few days. Hey, you know what? I'll wait for you at Agius's. Gods know he could use some help. I'll meet you there. Deal, Meg said. Karen immediately started to row away. She held up her hand in a wave. Phil did the same, and they silently watched one another for as long as they could. Then a shadow crossed Meg's face. They had entered the cave. A low moan came from somewhere in the darkness, and then another. Meg felt a bump underneath the boat and tug on her dress. She jumped back. Something had just reached up and grabbed her. No matter how many times she rode in this boat, it was a feeling she could not get used to. Keep your limbs inside the boat, mortal, or they'll pull you down with them, Karen said in a gravelly voice. Meg swallowed hard and tried not to imagine the river beneath them filled with thousands of lost souls who would do anything to get out. She pulled her arms and legs in and sat down on the narrow bench, peering into the darkness surrounding her. The moaning continued, as did the boat swaying, while the dead tried to climb aboard. How long is this going to take? Hades had always been so busy talking her ear off for her to pay attention for how much time had passed, but she didn't remember the ride being this long. Karen slowly but surely steered them forward. The land of the dead is a large place, and not a quick journey. It's meant to give you time to process all you've lost. Meg closed her eyes, trying to block out the cries, but it was near impossible. Don't look at the water. Don't look at the water. She thought about how she had lost track of time in the underworld before, about Phil's warning not to lose her bearings. It would be so easy to get pulled into the darkness, to give up hope, as though shrieking beneath her were demanding she do. Think of something happy, Meg told herself. Think of something good so you aren't pulled under. Wonder Boy. Meg smiled to herself as she recalled the one and only chance she'd had to cook for him. You did all this? He'd asked when she'd convinced him to meet her one afternoon at the lake, where they had gone rowing. She was supposed to be scouting a minotaur to add to Hades' cause, while Hercules was supposed to be throwing discuses to keep his hero skill sharp. But she figured they needed to eat anyway. No one would miss them for one measly hour. What do you think? She asked, motioning to the blanket on the grass and the assortment of foods. There were nuts and dates, warm bread and cheese that she had gotten at the market, and center stage was a fish roasting under a small fire. No one's ever cooked for me before, Hercules said, heading over to admire the blackening trout. He looked at her sheepishly. Except my mother. And actually, Phil, but he's terrible. Don't tell him I said that, he added quickly, and she laughed. Your secret's safe with me, Wonder Boy. She motioned to the blanket. Sit down, eat something. We'll have to get going before long. Hercules looked like a kid with a new toy as he ripped off a piece of bread, pairing it with a hunk of cheese and some dates. The fish smells delicious. I didn't know you could cook. There's a lot that you don't know about me, she said lightly. I taught myself, actually. My mother was always working and exhausted when she came home at night, so I helped by making our meals. I'd spend hours in the market talking to the different vendors and pestering them with questions about cooking fish and what cheeses to pair with what meats and how to roll grape leaves, and by the time my mother got home, She'd have full spread waiting. She checked the fish again. It was the one time of day she didn't look tired. She stopped herself when she heard her admission and glanced over at Hercules. He was listening with rapt attention. I'm boring you, aren't I? I don't usually tell everyone my life story. She never told anyone that particular anecdote, actually. Not even Aggius. What was she doing? Cooking for the man that Hades wanted to take down. She felt Wonder Boy's hand on her shoulder. You can tell me anything, Meg. I want to hear it all. I want to know everything about you. Are you sure about that? She couldn't help saying. I'm sure, he said. And then he leaned down and kissed her. His lips tasted sweet like the dates he'd just eaten. She'd kissed him right back. Meg saw a flash and looked up. Torches were coming alive along the cave's path, and she suddenly remembered where she was. Get ready, mortal, Charon said. You may have gotten by me, but Cerberus won't be forgiving.